Is Russia's offensive running out of steam? Have the Ukrainians stopped them almost everywhere? Or are they just turning and going in yet another direction? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is January 14th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get right into it. Okay, first, let's take a look at the control map, right? This is always, a couple of hours behind the situation, which normally is not a problem, but in fast-breaking events like, well, the ones going on now, there will be a little bit of delta between this and some of the other mapping. But it talks about how first you're seeing some level of advances near Krasnohora. You guys can see, I think this is probably part of a planned withdrawal. I think the Ukrainian forces, some reporting indicates that they're making an organized withdrawal to alternative defense lines. And so it makes, as we've talked about, makes logical sense that Ukrainians want to set up in these very defensible urban areas and force the Russians to expose themselves in these open areas. If you guys are members of the Patreon, we actually took a look at a video yesterday, Friday, where we saw a Russian attack across open ground. First, that they're willing to make these sort of attacks is crazy. And just the level, just how effective Ukrainian forces from a covered and concealed position are able to just stop this attack cold, especially given that it was like a 50-person assault. So if you're not a member, you can check out the link down below and sign up to get access to the weekly combat video breakdowns, where I try to do every like viral hit. There's a couple that are so intense I don't like to do them, but almost every one of those viral videos that you know what I'm talking about, I've checked out. Including, we also looked at the bunker video. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, here's Krasnohora. Ukrainian forces, I suspect, digging in these defensive positions and forcing the Russians into a less defensible position where they're going to be harder to break Ukrainian lines. You can see here that Ukraine still argues that Soledar is contested. It's debatable where Blahodatne ends and Soledar begins. That's pretty normal for these sort of towns. But it's sort of immaterial. The vast majority of Soledar is Russian held. And Russians are supposedly advancing towards this northern village, which is not labeled on the map, but it's called Sil. But you guys can see here, again, it requires traversing a lot of open ground. When we look over to the combat map, you guys can see that right now they're not reporting any Russian attacks, but I'm fairly certain this is just a reporting issue. Russia has been pressing its attack considerably. You can see here, this actually argues that a more significant portion of Soledar is still contested. There's a rail yard here that is listed as contested, as well as what looks like a rail interchange right here. So there's still some important infrastructure that they are reporting is not under Russian control. And again, I think the level of contested areas is significant, but I also believe ultimately Ukraine is going to do a controlled withdrawal and set up some sort of defensive effort along this infrastructure line. It seems like this is what they're going for, using this rail line as kind of a what's the word I want? Like a handrail almost. And that's not the doctrinal term, I know. So we also talk about, this is the area of Sil. You can see here a major rail yard to the north of Soledar out here, and Russia again trying to advance across open ground to take some of this urban terrain. When we look at War Mapper, who's generally been one of our most up-to-date sources for this sort of thing, first we can take a look at the overall Bakhmut Soledar excuse me, situation. The winter is not long in Texas, and the allergy season is. Okay, you can see here that Russia is continuing to press attacks both in the south near Klachivka and Kurdyumivka, as well as in Soledar, and they're going right now for Sil. I apologize if that's not pronounced correctly, but this is well, as we've seen, it has a significant rail yard But I really, really think that Ukrainian armed forces are going to be trying to establish an improved defensive line that more or less tracks along these urban areas, force the Russians to cross large open fields. I mean, that was so successful for them in Bakhmut. You guys can see that despite a lot of Russian efforts, they still struggle to take anything in the eastern portion of Bakhmut. Let's see. I don't know if the control map also has Russian forces as having been pushed out of these regions. No, it has them having made tiny advances. But even here, you guys can see that they're really struggle. It's really a struggle for Russian forces to take any of these city blocks. And you can see that even now, it's an absolute slog. These are probably a few, maybe dozen feet in total distance, and they have paid a massive price. But once they establish this foothold, it's much easier to systematically, block by block, start to make advances. But you guys saw that for weeks when they were outside, before they had these sort of controlled areas, they spent so much time trapped in these outskirts, right? You could see basically the entire month of December, Russian forces just tried and tried to take and hold some sort of urban foothold, and they just could not do it. It was just too hard to cross open ground to seize a hold on this small developed area. But then once they do, it's easier to push and not get pushed out. I think that's what Ukraine's going to try to do here. Build up an urban defensive line, Krasnohorda, Parskoviva, down here at Yadhine. They might even use this small river, the Bakhmutka, as another like barrier, and just try to hold everything here where the lines are more stable, and force the Russians again to hold minimal amounts of urban terrain and the maximum amount of open terrain. Anyway, one other thing I want to point out, right? Zelensky promises to do everything necessary to defend Soledar from Russia. And always take translations with a grain of salt, because sometimes everything necessary may be one of those couched words or phrases. In English, though, if we were to say we're going to do everything necessary, that would imply that we will not lose Soledar. And I want you as viewers, and I hope the Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, keeps perspective that Bakhmut its only objective is a meat grinder. It is to grind the Russian forces down. You can see here, there is so much open terrain that would be absolutely punishing for the Russians to take, even if they could. And these tremendous advances, you guys can see, when you spread them back out, if we go backwards a month, you guys could see that Russia's advances in the grand scheme of things, right? This is, for example, the territory liberated in the Kharkiv offensive. You guys could see that Russia's largest advance of the last, I'm going to say, probably 6 months, maybe 3 months, it's not exactly crushing it. You guys could see that in the larger picture, one, Bakhmut, not strategically all that important. And Soledar, even less so. It's a mining town. And I know people are going to be like, the salt mines can be used for blah, 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 blah. But listen, almost every village and town is going to have something that can be repurposed for strategic value. I wouldn't sit there and say that the salt mines are some sort of game changer, essential thing. Because remember, even if you store everything in the salt mines, it's got to come out of the salt mines, and it'll be vulnerable at that point. In fact, in some ways, it'll be more vulnerable because you'll have this narrow entrance where things can come in and out, and it's easy to target that, even if you can't target the salt mines themselves. You may have just made the tomb of Russian ammunition. So we need to remember that we zoom out and we say, okay, Bakhmut and Soledar are not worth. They are worth it in the sense that they are burning Russian combat power. They are burning mobilized troops and recently deployed equipment. And Russia is getting ever weaker in stores, while Ukraine seems to be getting stronger and stronger, especially with the recent announcement made official that the UK is going to be providing some Challenger 2 tanks. Modern main battle tanks are historically have been pretty decisive. Soviet-made battle tanks from the same era was what Saddam Hussein fielded in the First and Second Gulf Wars, and by all accounts, even a 20 and 30-year-old iteration of the US's main battle tank and the Challenger, I think they were Challenger 1s back then, and the Abrams, absolutely mopped the floor with these Soviet-made tanks. So, Ukraine's priority should remain creating these decisive engagements, decisive attack, whether, like we saw in Kherson, where they took a large portion of territory without firing a shot. You guys could see, relative to what Russia gave up in Kherson, these actions in Bakhmut they're just not significant. So I would caution against turning Soledar in our minds or in the minds of the decision makers. It shouldn't be anything more than what it is, which is a small outlying village that the Russians are bizarrely fixated on capturing, and that while losing, you shouldn't give up territory. It's okay to inflict maximum casualties in exchange for relatively meaningless territory. And that, I hope, is the perspective that Ukrainians are doing, even though, as we talked about, the U.S. is guilty of this too, of taking non-strategic, going into an engagement knowing that it's okay to yield territory and to let the enemy have this if you force them to pay a high enough price. And you say that at the beginning, but then over time you become invested in defending this meaningless territory, and eventually you find yourself committing way too many resources and deciding when it's almost too late that no, in fact, we have to hold this territory. I can't even tell you how many times in the U.S. Military and even geopolitical experience this has happened, that we've decided something that was trivially important at the start suddenly becomes decisively important. Soledar is not that. Bakhmut is not that. And when we zoom out of even just the portion of the country that Russia controls, we should understand that, if Russia continues to advance at this pace, they will arrive in Kramatorsk probably sometime around the, in the 2030s. So I'm exaggerating, but not by much. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Of course, be sure to check out the Patreon. Thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. As always, you guys are one of the thing that sustains this channel. You guys have seen other YouTubers reporting the same thing that I have been, that YouTube has been cracking the whip on combat videos, and even on profanity, right? YouTube wants to become a more family-friendly platform, but I think what I'm doing out here is trying to keep you guys informed in an unbiased, objective way about what's going on in the world. And I think that's an important function, even if it's not necessarily kid-friendly. Anyway, that's all I had. I'll see you guys in the next one.